Hello, Anna Abramowitz here. How are you doing today? Let's talk about scenarios, okay? All right. So I have three little points that just came into my mind, and I just really wanted to discuss them with you. And they've been coming out of the discussions I've been having, not only through the students that have been working through the course, my scenario design course, but also some of the workshop participants that when I was doing the last workshop, some of these questions actually came up, and I thought I'd address them here because I'm thinking that they might be something that we all need to think about. So one of the interesting parts is when we were talking about scenarios during one of the workshops, and one of the participants said, well, I can't come up with compelling alternatives because the alternative is death. Like, as in, the people who were being trained were being trained in things that were so dangerous that the alternative to them not following the procedure would be death. And I thought, well, that's perfect. A lot of us try and find consequences that are meaningful, or we amp up something that is maybe in real life not as dramatic every time, but our goal is to amp up the consequences to have a good lesson, right? And so when your alternative to not following procedures is death, or something equally, well, there's nothing as bad as death, but like getting maimed or things like that, personal injury, that's an excellent scenario question. That's an excellent scenario reason to use scenarios. And think about the fact that people who are in those situations need to practice good procedures, good tasks, good execution of those tasks over and over, so that when they get to the real world, they've actually at least got some idea of the consequences of poor decision making in the field. So anytime you have some kind of a process where the injury or the damage is huge, a scenario is almost a no-brainer. Although obviously, you still have to do the analysis to make sure that you're targeting the right people who are making the mistakes, and you're targeting the processes that actually are impactful. So that's that on that. Now, one of the things that also we've been kind of, and I get challenged with this as well. When you start with a scenario, you have this idea in mind of the kind of situation you want to tackle. But you cannot start developing your scenario from there. Because the problem is with us humans is we have a great imagination, and we can anticipate all kinds of different situations happening. And so what happens is, if you start from the situation and then work through the outcomes like top down, basically, what happens is you get lost in all those branches, and you dilute your story, and you dilute your purpose. So the way to work through a scenario, and this is advice, I got fabulous advice from Sergey Snegirev, who is the CEO of BranchTrack. He said, start with the end in mind. So if I'm trying to prevent, let's say, somebody hurting themselves on the job, I would potentially only have two outcomes. One is where they execute something well and they're successful, and that's my one outcome. And the other one is that they hurt themselves. So I start with those two pieces at the bottom, and then I work backwards to see what mistakes or what decisions were made along the way that help me get to either path. Because the problem is, if you start up top, as I said, you come up with all these potential opportunities, but then you start thinking about all these options that may not, nuances, decisions, without having these two pieces to work from, you will create a very large scenario that doesn't necessarily meet your needs and is in effect almost too complicated to actually be helpful. I mean, really think about the MVP. Minimum viable product. What are the lessons? What are the steps that somebody needs to go through that are most impactful and don't distract from the message? Because that's your goal, is to have them practice over and over something that where they're getting really good consequences and feedback. There's no ambiguity. they still have to, it's best when a learner still has a lot of autonomy as far as deciding how something turned out because they're observing it. But you still want that to be a fairly structured situation. So when you do branching sometimes is dangerous because if you start from the very beginning, that goes out of hand. And that brings me to another point, which is that as instructional designers or as designers of scenarios, whatever name you want to call yourself, the person who's designing that, your branches are constraints. They have to be constraints. So one of the things that came up in a workshop as well is somebody said, well, what if my learner, when they're working through the scenario and they get these 3 options, they think, well, I wouldn't pick any of those. I would think of this option. That's fine. The scenario is a constrained environment where each one of your branches is actually a representation of the common mistakes, misconceptions, and assumptions. It will not be everybody's assumptions. It will not be everybody's mistakes. But these are the ones that you and a subject matter expert have identified as the key areas you wanted to tackle. And so when the learner is in the point of view of the person that they're working through the scenario through with, in that reality, those are their options. And that's why it makes it sometimes easier when you set up a story around a scenario, because then you can say, like in Broken Coworker, Sam only saw, from his perspective, only these options as available to him when dealing with a bully like Emma. So those are the things that you need to consider. And that's why I think a lot of us, when we're working with either software or opportunities to branch things, we really think about all the options instead of really scaling it down and thinking about what are the 2-3 most common mistakes and assumptions people make and how do they lead to these bottom pieces, and really constrain yourself there. You can always add frills and, little pieces here and there to make it a little bit more interesting and nuanced. But in the beginning, you have to really discipline yourself to think of it in a very constrained way, because that will help you create a meaningful scenario and something that you can actually put out to a learner, get feedback, and then iterate on. So it's better than something big, because then the pathways are more clear. So I hope that was helpful, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of the week. I'll talk to you soon.